I received a cry for help in the middle of the night and drove 200 kilometers through the snow to find my husband shivering in an abandoned station. My daughter had robbed him and thrown him out. So I made her pay dearly. The gold digger begged me for forgiveness. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The phone rang at 2:43 in the morning, cutting through the silence like a scream. I fumbled for it in the darkness, my heart already racing. After 38 years of marriage, you develop an instinct for these things. Middle of the night calls never bring good news. Connie? Richard's voice was barely a whisper, shaking with cold and something else I couldn't identify. Fear, maybe. I need help. I sat up, instantly alert. Richard? Where are you? What's wrong? I'm at some abandoned train station. I don't know exactly where. There's a sign that says Millfield Junction. His teeth were chattering so hard I could hear them through the phone. Peyton, she changed the locks. She threw me out, Connie. She said I don't live there anymore. My blood turned to ice. Peyton, our 34-year-old daughter, had been living with us for the past 2 years after her divorce. We'd welcomed her back with open arms, happy to help her get back on her feet. She'd been so sweet, so grateful, taking care of little things around the house, helping Richard with his medications, managing some of the household bills. What do you mean she threw you out? It's your house, Richard. Our house. She said it's not anymore. His voice cracked. She has papers, Connie. Official papers. She says the house is in her name now, and I'm trespassing. I was already getting dressed, pulling on jeans and a heavy sweater. Stay right there. Don't move. I'm coming to get you. The snow's coming down hard. The roads are, I don't care about the roads. You stay put and stay warm. Do you hear me? The drive from my sister's house in Bakersfield to Millfield Junction was a nightmare. 200 miles through a blizzard that seemed to get worse with every passing mile. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, and more than once I had to pull over just to clear the glass, but all I could think about was Richard, 66 years old and sitting alone in the cold. My Richard, who'd worked double shifts at the plant for 25 years to give us a good life. Who'd never missed one of Peyton's school plays or soccer games, even when he was dead tired. Who'd mortgaged our house to pay for her college education because he believed she deserved the best, the same Richard who now sounded so broken, so confused on the phone. I found him huddled on a bench inside the old station building, which thankfully still had some shelter from the wind. He looked smaller than I remembered, older. His jacket was too thin for the weather, and his lips had a bluish tint that scared me. Oh, honey. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling how cold he was even through his clothes. Let's get you warmed up. In the car, with the heater blasting, Richard slowly started to tell me what had happened. He'd been watching television after dinner when Peyton came into the living room with a stack of papers and a serious expression. She said we needed to talk about my situation, Richard explained, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup I'd brought from a 24-hour diner. She said she'd been doing some research, and that because of my age and some health issues I didn't even know I had, it wasn't safe for me to be making important decisions anymore. Health issues? Richard, you're fine. Dr. Martinez just gave you a clean bill of health last month. That's what I told her. But she had these medical records. Reports from doctors I've never seen. They said I was showing signs of dementia, that my judgment was compromised. He shook his head. I tried to argue, but she got so upset. Started crying, saying she was only trying to protect me. The more he talked, the sicker I felt. According to Richard, Peyton had presented him with legal documents that supposedly transferred ownership of the house into her name, for his protection. She'd explained that this way, if he ever needed long-term care, the house would be safe from being seized by Medicare. She said it was just a formality, that nothing would really change. But then tonight, when I questioned some charges on the credit card bill, she exploded. Richard's voice got smaller. She said I had no right to question her decisions anymore. That the house was hers now, and if I didn't like how she was handling things, I could leave. And when you refused? She called someone. A locksmith, I think. While I was in the bathroom, she had them change all the locks. When I came out, my suitcase was packed and sitting by the door. His eyes filled with tears. She handed me $50 and said I could find a motel for the night. That we'd discuss my living arrangements tomorrow. I pulled over at a rest stop, needing a moment to process what I was hearing. This wasn't the Peyton I knew. Sure, she'd always been a little self-centered, a little dramatic. But this was different. This was calculated. Cruel. Richard, do you remember signing anything? Any papers at all? He rubbed his forehead, looking confused and exhausted. Maybe? She'd been having me sign things for weeks now. Said it was all Routine stuff, updating insurance beneficiaries, organizing our financial paperwork. I trusted her, Connie. She's our daughter. That's when it hit me. The phone calls over the past few months where Peyton would quickly hand the phone to Richard when I asked to speak with him. The way she'd started answering his cell phone, saying he was resting or busy. The sudden interest in helping with household management, she hadn't been helping. She'd been planning. We drove back to Bakersfield in silence, Richard dozing fitfully in the passenger seat. But I was wide awake, my mind racing. Tomorrow, I'd start making calls. I'd find out exactly what papers Richard had signed and what legal rights we still had, but deep down, I already knew this was bigger than just some forged documents or a moment of confusion. This felt like a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it made my chest ache just thinking about it. My own daughter had thrown her father out into a snowstorm. And something told me we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. The morning after brought no relief, only a clearer picture of how deep this betrayal ran. I'd barely slept, lying next to Richard in my sister's guest room, listening to him mumble in his sleep, fragments of conversations with Peyton, apologies for things he'd never done wrong. Over breakfast, Richard's hands shook as he tried to butter his toast. Not from the cold this time, but from something deeper. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a devastation I'd never seen in him before. I keep thinking I must have missed something, he said quietly. Some sign that she was planning this. But Connie, she seemed so caring. So concerned about our future. I reached across the table and covered his trembling hand with mine. Tell me everything, Richard. Every conversation, every paper she asked you to sign. We need to understand what we're dealing with. What emerged over the next hour was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months in the making. It started small, Peyton offering to help organize their paperwork, suggesting they update their wills and insurance policies now that she was living with them again. She'd been so thoughtful, so mature about it. She said it was time she took some responsibility for family finances, Richard explained. That she felt guilty about moving back in after her divorce, and wanted to contribute somehow. She offered to take over paying the monthly bills, said it would free me up to enjoy my retirement more. The red flags I should have noticed were becoming obvious now. How Peyton always answered the phone when I called the house, claiming Richard was napping. Or out running errands. How she'd started handling their mail, their appointments. How she'd convinced Richard to switch to a new bank that offered better interest rates on their savings. She seemed so knowledgeable about financial planning, Richard continued. She'd researched everything, Medicare regulations, estate planning, asset protection. I was impressed. I thought she'd finally found her direction in life. But the most chilling part was how systematically Peyton had isolated Richard from anyone who might question her actions. She'd convinced him to stop his weekly coffee meetings with his old work buddies, saying they were just complaining sessions. That brought him down. She'd discouraged visits from our neighbors, claiming they were too nosy and gossipy. She'd even suggested that my frequent phone calls were stressing him out. She said you worried too much about money, that it made you call and check on me constantly, Richard admitted, shame coloring his voice. She thought if I handled things more independently, it would be better for both of us. Better for our marriage. By 10 that morning, I was on the phone with Richard's longtime friend Tom, who happened to be a retired attorney. Tom's voice turned grim as I described what had happened. Connie, you need to get down to that house today and see exactly what documents exist. This sounds like elder financial abuse, but we need to know what we're dealing with legally. She changed the locks. She said Richard was trespassing. Legally, she can't do that if both their names are on the deed. And if Richard signed papers under coercion or while mentally compromised, those signatures might not be valid. An hour later, Richard and I were standing on the porch of the house we'd called home for 15 years. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell of my own home. Peyton answered wearing silk pajamas at 11 in the morning, her hair perfectly styled. She looked like she'd been expecting us. Dad, Mom. Her voice was cool, controlled. I wasn't sure when you'd be back. This is our house, Peyton, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. We'd like to come in. She stepped aside, but her body language made it clear we were unwelcome guests. The house looked different somehow. Smaller personal items were gone, Richard's reading glasses from the coffee table, my knitting basket from the corner, family photos from the mantelpiece. We need to talk about what happened last night, Richard began. What happened is that you had an episode, Dad. You became confused and aggressive when I tried to discuss your medication schedule. I had to make a difficult decision for your own safety. The lie came so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a moment I almost doubted what Richard had told me. But then I saw his face, the hurt, the confusion, the recognition that his own daughter was gaslighting him. That's not what happened, he said quietly. Dad, your memory isn't what it used to be. The doctors have been very clear about that. Peyton pulled out a manila folder from the kitchen counter. I have all the medical documentation right here. Dr. Stevens, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Kim, they all agree that you're showing signs of cognitive decline. She spread the papers across the dining room table like evidence in a trial. Medical reports, psychological evaluations, competency assessments. All dated within the past 3 months. All from doctors Richard swore he'd never seen. I don't understand, Richard whispered, staring at a report that claimed he'd scored poorly on memory tests. When did I see these doctors? During your appointment. Days. You know, the appointments I've been taking you to. Peyton's voice carried a note of exaggerated patience, like she was speaking to a child. You don't always remember them clearly because of your condition. That's when I noticed the prescription bottles lined up on the kitchen counter. At least 8 different medications, all with Richard's name on them. I picked up one of the bottles. A powerful anti-anxiety medication I'd never seen before. Richard, are you taking all of these? He looked genuinely bewildered. Peyton handles my medications now. She said it was too confusing for me to keep track of them all. Because it was, Dad. You were missing doses, taking double doses. It was dangerous. Peyton moved to stand between Richard and the pill bottles, her body language protective but somehow threatening at the same time. I've been managing your health because you can't anymore. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The medical appointments Richard couldn't remember. The medications that were making him confused and forgetful. The gradual isolation from friends and family. The financial documents signed while he was in a medicated fog. I want to see the deed to this house, I said firmly. Peyton's smile never wavered. Of course. I have all the important paperwork organized now. She pulled out another folder, this one thick with legal documents. Everything's been transferred into my name for asset protection purposes. It's a common estate planning strategy. There it was, in black and white. The deed to our house, dated 3 weeks ago, with Richard's signature transferring full ownership to Peyton Marie Harrison. Their joint bank accounts, now solely in Peyton's name. Even Richard's retirement account had been moved, with Peyton listed as the primary beneficiary and account manager. When did you sign all this? I asked Richard. He stared at the papers, his face pale. I remember signing some things. But Peyton said it was just updating beneficiaries. She said nothing would really change. And nothing has changed, Dad. You're still living here. You still have access to everything you need. Peyton's voice carried a sharp edge now. The only difference is that your assets are protected, and I'm here to make sure you don't make any financial mistakes that could jeopardize your future care. But I was looking at the dates on the bank statements. In the past 3 weeks, there had been several large withdrawals. $5,000 here, $8,000 there. When I pointed this out, Peyton had ready answers. Home improvements that were needed for Dad's safety. A new security system. Updates to the bathroom to make it more accessible. She gestured around the house. Everything I've done has been for his benefit. Yet I couldn't see any evidence of these improvements. What I could see was that my daughter had managed to gain complete control over my husband's life in a matter of months. And now she was acting like she was doing us a favor by allowing us into our own home. The worst part was watching Richard's face as the reality sank in. This wasn't confusion or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated takeover of his entire existence. And the person who had orchestrated it was the daughter he'd sacrificed everything to provide for. As we left that day, because staying was clearly not an option, I saw Peyton watching us from the living room window. There was no guilt in her expression, no remorse. Just the satisfied look of someone who had gotten exactly what she wanted, but I had a feeling there was still more to this story. And whatever it was going to be worse than anything we'd discovered so far. The next 3 days were a blur of phone calls, research, and a growing sense of dread as I uncovered the true scope of what Peyton had done to us. Tom had given me the name of a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse cases, and what Sarah Mitchell found made my blood run cold. Your daughter didn't do this alone, Sarah told me as we sat in her small office, surrounded by file folders and photographs. This level of sophistication, the fake medical records, the legal documents, she had professional help. She slid a photograph across the desk. A tall man with graying temples and an expensive suit, standing next to Peyton outside what looked like a law office. They were holding hands. Meet Derek Castellanos. 42 years old, attorney specializing in estate planning and elder law. Also happens to be your daughter's boyfriend for the past 6 months. I stared at the photo, feeling sick. I've never seen him before. Peyton never mentioned dating anyone. That's because she was keeping him a secret. Derek has a very specific reputation in certain circles. He's known for helping people navigate complex inheritance situations, often in ways that push ethical boundaries. Sarah pulled out another folder, this one containing what looked like financial records. Derek's been in some trouble before. 3 years ago, he was investigated for helping a client gain control of her elderly mother's assets through questionable means. The case was dropped when the mother died, but the State Bar Association has been watching him closely ever since. The pieces were falling together with horrible clarity. This wasn't just a daughter taking advantage of her aging father. This was a carefully orchestrated con game, with Richard as the target and Derek as the mastermind. How long has this been planned? I asked. Based on what I've found, probably since shortly after Peyton's divorce was finalized. She was facing significant debt, her ex-husband got most of their assets, and she was looking at the possibility of bankruptcy. Sarah flipped through more documents. That's when she moved back in with you and Richard. And that's when she met Derek. The investigation revealed that Derek had been coaching Peyton every step of the way. The fake medical appointments were conducted by a doctor who'd had his license suspended but was still operating under Derek's protection. The medications Richard had been given were designed to create exactly the kind of confusion and memory problems that would support claims of dementia. They've been drugging him, Sarah said bluntly. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to make him compliant and forgetful. The anti-anxiety medication alone would explain why he's been so passive about signing documents he doesn't remember. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Sarah handed me a copy of what looked like a real estate listing. Your house is already on the market. Listed privately, not through MLS, which is why you haven't seen it advertised. They're asking $450,000. I felt the room spin around me. She's selling our home? Gets worse. I found evidence of a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. 2-bedroom, monthly rent of $3,000. Lease starts next month. The plan was becoming crystal clear. Derek and Peyton weren't just stealing Richard's assets, they were preparing to disappear with them. They'd sell the house, liquidate his retirement accounts, and leave California entirely. And Richard? Based on what I found next, his fate was the most chilling part of all. I need to show you something else, Sarah said, pulling out a brochure for what looked like a long-term care facility. But this wasn't the kind of place you'd choose for someone you loved. The photos showed a rundown building with tiny rooms and overworked staff. Sunset Manor Care Facility. State-funded, minimal services, and they have a reputation for accepting patients that other places won't take. Derek submitted an application for Richard 2 weeks ago. My hands were shaking as I read through the application. It painted Richard as a severely demented man with violent tendencies who required constant supervision. The monthly cost would eat up his Social Security payments entirely, leaving nothing for additional care or comfort. They were planning to dump him there, I whispered. While they started their new life in Arizona with close to $700,000 in liquid assets. That evening, I sat with Richard in my sister's living room, trying to figure out how to tell him what we'd learned. He'd been quieter over the past few days, and I could see he was still processing the betrayal. Learning that it was even worse than we'd thought might break him entirely, but Richard deserved to know the truth. Honey, I began carefully, I need to tell you about what Sarah found. As I explained about Derek, about the planned move to Arizona, about the care facility, I watched Richard's face change. The confusion and hurt were still there, but something else was emerging. Something I hadn't seen in months, anger. She was going to put me in that place and leave the state. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it now. While she and this man lived off the money I worked 30 years to save. Richard, we're going to stop them. Tom thinks we can challenge all the documents. The medical records are fake, you were medicated without your knowledge, we have grounds to reverse everything. But Richard was staring at the brochure for Sunset Manor, his jaw clenched tight. Do you know what this place is, Connie? I drove past it once when I was visiting Jimmy Morrison after his stroke. The smell in the hallways, the way the patients just sat staring at nothing. Jimmy begged his son not to leave him there. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but a kind of fierce determination. She was willing to throw me away like garbage. Her own father. And for what? Money she didn't earn, from a life she contributed nothing to. That night, Richard called Peyton. I listened on the extension as he told her he'd been thinking about everything she'd said, and that maybe she was right about him needing more help. He asked if they could meet tomorrow to discuss his care options and some additional paperwork that needed to be signed up. Peyton's voice was sugar-sweet as she agreed. She even offered to have Derek join them, since he'd been so helpful with the legal aspects of Richard's situation. That would be wonderful, Richard said, his voice perfectly calm. I'd like to meet this young man who's been looking out for Our family's interests. After he hung up, Richard turned to me with a look I recognized. It was the same expression he'd worn when he decided to work double shifts to pay for Peyton's college. The same determination that had carried him through every challenge in his life. They think I'm a confused old man they can manipulate, he said quietly. Tomorrow, we're going to show them exactly how wrong they are. But as I looked at my husband, really looked at him for the first time in months, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The medications Peyton had been giving him weren't just clearing out of his system. They were revealing someone I barely recognized. Someone harder, more calculating than the gentleman I'd married, and I couldn't help but wonder, what exactly was Richard planning to do? The meeting was set for 2 o'clock at the house, our house, though it felt strange thinking of it that way now. Richard had spent the morning going through old papers in my sister's spare bedroom, organizing things with a methodical precision that should have comforted me. Instead, it made me nervous. "What are you looking for?" I asked, watching him sort through bank statements and insurance documents. "Evidence," he said simply. "Peyton thinks she's been clever, but she made one crucial mistake. She underestimated how much I actually know about our finances." At 1:30, we drove to the house. In silence. Richard sat beside me, wearing his best suit, the navy one he'd bought for Peyton's wedding 4 years ago. His hands were steady now, no trace of the tremor that had plagued him for months. It was remarkable how quickly his health had improved. Once those mystery medications were out of his system, Peyton answered the door with that same artificial smile, but this time she wasn't alone. Derek Castellanos stood behind her, and seeing him in person made my skin crawl. He had the kind of practiced charm that some people mistake for sincerity, all perfect teeth and calculated warmth. "Richard, Connie, so good to finally meet you." "Both," Derek said, extending his hand. "Peyton's told me so much about you." "I'm sure she has," Richard replied, shaking Derek's hand with what looked like genuine friendliness. "And I'm grateful for all the help you've given our family during this difficult transition." We sat around the dining room table, the same table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Now it felt like enemy territory. Derek spread out several documents with the kind of theatrical precision I imagined he used in court. "I've prepared a few additional forms. That will help streamline your care arrangements," Derek began. "Just some updates to your medical directives and a power of attorney document that will give Peyton more flexibility in managing your healthcare decisions." Richard nodded thoughtfully, picking up one of the papers. "This is very thorough. You've obviously put a lot of work into this." "Well, Peyton's happiness is very important to me," Derek said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "And making sure you're properly cared for is part of that." That's when Richard looked up with an expression that was perfectly innocent. "Speaking of care, I was wondering about the facility you mentioned. Sunset Manor? I'd like to know more about their services." I saw the briefest flicker of surprise cross Derek's face before he recovered. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." Richard's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone had changed. "The application you submitted on my behalf. For the state-funded care facility with the reputation for accepting difficult patients." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Peyton's smile faltered, and Derek's practiced composure cracked just enough to reveal the calculating mind beneath. "Dad, I think you're confused again," Peyton began, but Richard held up a hand. "No, sweetheart, I'm not confused. For the first time in months, I'm thinking very clearly." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "In fact, I've been doing quite a bit of thinking lately. And research." "What?" Richard laid out on that table over the next hour was devastating. While Derek and Peyton had been busy forging medical records and transferring assets, Richard had been quietly documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction, every medication he'd been given, every conversation that had seemed strange at the time but made perfect sense now. "You see, Derek, you made one fundamental error in your planning," Richard said, his voice calm and almost professorial. "You assumed I was actually developing dementia. But I've been keeping detailed records of everything that's happened to me for the past 6 months." He pulled out a small notebook, its pages covered with Richard's careful handwriting. Dates, times, medications administered, conversations overheard, financial discrepancies. It was a meticulous chronicle of their entire scheme. "June 15th, Peyton gives me 2 new pills, says they're vitamins. Feel foggy and confused for hours afterward. June 22nd, wake up to find Peyton in my office, going through financial papers. Claims she's organizing them." Derek's face had gone pale. "This is all very interesting, Richard, but I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Richard opened another folder. "Like the fact that you've been operating with a suspended medical license in Nevada." Or that the doctor who's been providing these fake evaluations lost his California license 2 years ago for insurance fraud. Peyton finally found her voice. Dad, you're being paranoid. Derek's been trying to help us, help you steal everything I've worked for my entire life. Richard's voice cut through her protests like a blade. Did you really think I wouldn't notice $700,000 missing from accounts I've been managing for 40 years? That's when Derek made his first real mistake. Instead of continuing to deny everything, he shifted tactics. Richard, even if some of what you're saying is true, the legal transfers are valid. The house is in Peyton's name. The accounts have been moved. You can make all the accusations you want, but the law is on our side. Richard smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Is it, though? He pulled out another set of documents, and I recognized the letterhead of Tom's law firm. You see, Derek, while you were busy forging medical records, I was working with a real attorney. One who specializes in elder abuse cases and financial crimes. The papers Richard spread out were court documents. Legal challenges to every transfer, every signature, every medical evaluation. But more than that, they were criminal complaints. Fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, practicing medicine without a license. The district attorney's office is very interested in your methods, Derek. Especially since this isn't the first time you've used them. Derek was on his feet now, his smooth facade completely gone. You can't prove any of this. Those signatures are valid. The medical evaluations are forgeries created by a man who hasn't been licensed to practice medicine in 3 years. Richard's voice was steady, implacable. A man who, by the way, is currently cooperating with authorities to avoid prosecution himself. The room fell silent except for the sound of Peyton's labored breathing. She was staring at her father as if seeing him for the first time, and maybe she was. The confused, medicated old man she'd been manipulating was gone, replaced by someone who had outmaneuvered her completely. Dad, she whispered, I never meant, yes, you did. Richard's words were quiet but final. You meant every bit of it. You looked at your old father and saw nothing but an obstacle between you and money. You didn't earn. You were willing to drug me, lie about my mental state, and dump me in the worst care facility you could find. Also, you could run off with your boyfriend and live off my life's work. He stood up, gathering his papers with methodical care. But here's what you didn't understand, Peyton. I may be 66 years old, but I'm not stupid. And I'm certainly not the helpless victim you thought you were creating. Derek was already moving toward the door, but Richard's next words stopped him cold. I wouldn't leave just yet if I were you, Derek. You see, while we've been having this conversation, the police have been obtaining warrants for your office, your home, and your bank accounts. Something about a pattern of elder abuse and financial crime spanning several years. As if summoned by his words, there was a knock at the front door. Heavy, authoritative. The kind of knock that means your world is about to change forever. Richard looked at Peyton one last time, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of the father who had loved her unconditionally for 34 years. I gave you everything, sweetheart. My time, my money, my trust. And you threw it all away for a man who was using you just as much as you were using me. The knock came again, more insistent. This time, through the window, I could see police cars in the driveway, but as Richard walked to answer the door, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about justice or getting our money back. The look in Richard's eyes, the careful planning, the way he'd orchestrated this entire confrontation, this was about something much deeper. This was about making sure Peyton understood exactly what she'd lost. And something told me the lesson wasn't over yet. The arrest was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Derek tried to maintain his composure as the handcuffs clicked into place, but I could see the panic in his eyes as Detective Morrison read him. His rights. Financial fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, practicing law while knowingly using falsified medical documents. The charges seemed to go on forever. Peyton collapsed into a chair, watching in stunned silence as her boyfriend was led away in handcuffs. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the confident woman who had thrown her father out into the snow just days ago. In her place sat someone who looked very young and very lost. We'll need you to come down to the station as well, Miss Harrison, Detective Morrison said. His tone professional but not unkind. We have some questions about your role in this situation. Am I under arrest? Peyton's voice was barely a whisper. Not at this time. But I would strongly advise you to contact an attorney. After the police left with Derek, the house felt eerily quiet. Peyton sat at the dining room table, staring at the legal documents Richard had presented as evidence. Her carefully constructed world had crumbled in less than 2 hours, and she seemed unable to process what had happened. Dad, she finally said, her voice breaking, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know what you need. Richard interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge I'd never heard before, is to understand the full scope of what you've done. And what's going to happen next? He sat down across from her, and for a moment they looked like father and daughter again. But the resemblance was deceiving. The house will be transferred back into my name within the week. The bank accounts, the retirement funds, all of it. Your attorney friend might have thought he was clever, but he left a paper trail that a first-year law student could follow. Peyton nodded, tears streaming down her face. Okay. That's fair. That's right. But that's not all. Richard pulled out another folder, one I hadn't seen before. You see, Peyton, while I was documenting your theft, I discovered something else. Something that makes this betrayal even worse than I originally thought. He opened the folder and spread out financial statements I didn't recognize. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate documents, all bearing Peyton's name. For the past 3 years, ever since your divorce, you've been telling us you were broke. That you needed help getting back on your feet. That you had nothing left after your ex-husband took everything. Peyton's face went white. But the truth is, you walked away from your marriage with over $200,000 in assets. Money you've been hiding in offshore accounts and shell companies while living rent-free in our home and letting us pay your expenses. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Peyton, is this true? She couldn't meet my eyes. I needed to keep some money safe. In case things didn't work out. In case your plan to steal our life savings didn't work out, you mean? Richard's voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. You weren't desperate, sweetheart. You were just greedy. The next revelation was even worse. The debt Peyton claimed to have from her divorce, the credit card bills she'd been so worried about, the student loans she said were crushing her, none of it existed. She'd been living debt-free while manipulating us into believing she needed our help. Every sob story, every tear, every time you told us how grateful you were for our support, all of it was lies. Richard stood up, pacing to the window. You looked at your parents, who had sacrificed everything to give you a good life, and you saw nothing but marks in a con game. But the final piece of evidence was the most damning of all. Richard pulled out a thick stack of printed emails, and I recognized the account name at the top. Peyton's personal email, going back months. These are correspondence between you and Derek, planning this entire scheme. But they also show something else. He pulled out one particular email and read aloud. The old man is getting suspicious about the pills. We might need to increase the dosage to keep him compliant until the transfer is complete. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just been drugging Richard to make him confused, they'd been actively discussing how to make it worse. And this one, Richard continued, his voice deadly quiet. If he keeps asking questions about the money, we might need to move up our timeline. The nursing home application is already approved. We can have him committed as early as next week if necessary. Peyton was sobbing now, her face buried in her hands. Dad, please, I never wanted to hurt you. Derek said it was the only way, that you'd never agree to help me otherwise. Help you? Richard's voice cracked like a whip. Help you what, Peyton? You didn't need help. You needed an easy mark, and you chose your own father. That's when I found my voice. For days, I'd been focused on the legal aspects, the financial crimes, the betrayal of trust. But suddenly, all I could think about was that night in the snow, Richard shivering on a bench at an abandoned train station while his own daughter changed the locks on his home. You threw him out into a blizzard, I said, my voice shaking with rage. Your father, who worked himself to exhaustion to pay for your education, who mortgaged this house to give you the wedding of your dreams, who has never said no to you once in your entire life. And you threw him out into the cold like he was garbage. Peyton looked up at me, her mascara streaming down her cheeks. Mom, I was scared. Derek said if we didn't act fast, you and Dad would figure out what we were doing. I panicked. You panicked? I stood up so fast my chair fell over. You panicked so you decided to potentially kill your own father? Do you have any idea what could have happened to him out there? He's 66 years old, Peyton. He could have frozen to death. That seemed to break something in her. She collapsed completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I know I can't fix this. I know you'll never forgive me. But please, please don't let them send me to prison. I'll give back everything, I'll do whatever you want, but please. You'll give back everything? Richard's laugh was bitter and sharp. Peyton, you don't have anything left to give. The money you stole from us was already spent. Derek's apartment in Arizona, his car, the engagement ring he bought you with our retirement savings. It's all gone. He was right. The investigation had revealed that Derek had been living far beyond his means for years, using money stolen from elderly clients to fund a lifestyle of expensive cars, luxury travel, and high-stakes gambling. Our money, along with funds stolen from at least 6 other victims, had disappeared into his bottomless pit of debt and addiction. The house will come back to us because the transfer was fraudulent. But the cash, the investments, the money from your grandmother's inheritance that I was saving for your children's education, most of that is gone forever. Peyton stared at him in horror. Grandma's inheritance? But that was almost $100,000. Was being the operative term. Derek used it to pay off gambling debts last month. The silence that followed was deafening. Peyton sat there, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd lost. Not just her relationship with her parents, not just her freedom, but her entire future. The children she might have someday would never benefit from their great-grandmother's generosity because she'd thrown it away on a man who had been using her as much as she'd been using us. What happens now? She whispered. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression that frightened me. Not anger anymore, but something colder. Something final. Now you learn what it feels like to have nothing, he said quietly. To be completely alone, with no one to help you and nowhere to turn. You wanted to know what it was like to be in control of someone else's life? Now you get to find out what it's like when that control is taken away from you. He walked to the door, then paused. The police will probably offer you a deal if you testify against Derek. I'd recommend you take it. Because the alternative is spending the next 10 to 15 years in prison, and I don't think you're as strong as you believe you are. As we left the house, our house, I looked back to see Peyton still sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by the wreckage of her schemes. She looked small and broken, nothing like the confident woman who had manipulated us for months, but as I watched Richard walk to the car, I realized that something had broken in him too. The gentle, forgiving man I'd married was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who had learned that even the people you love most can destroy you if you let them, and I couldn't help but wonder if that was a lesson worth learning. Or if we'd all lost something precious that could never be recovered. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new home, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. We'd moved to a small town in Colorado called Cedar Falls, population 3,200. It was the kind of place where neighbors actually knew each other's names, and the biggest excitement was the annual harvest festival. Richard was in the garden, tending to the tomatoes we'd planted in spring. His hands were steady again, his color good. The medications were completely out of his system now, and with them had gone the confusion, the tremor, the fog that had made him seem older than his years. At 66, he looked healthier than he had in the past 2 years, but the real change was deeper than physical healing. The gentle man who had trusted everyone, who had always believed the best of people, was gone. In his place was someone more careful, more guarded. Someone who had learned that even love could be weaponized against you. Coffee's ready, I called out, pouring 2 cups of the strong brew Richard preferred. He came inside, dirt under his fingernails, a small smile on his face as he looked at the basket of vegetables he'd harvested. The peppers are coming in beautifully. Mrs. Henderson next door says she's never seen a garden produce so well in its first year. It was a simple conversation, the kind married couples have every morning. But there was a peace in it that we hadn't experienced in years. No walking on eggshells, no wondering who might call with demands or emergencies, no feeling like we needed to justify our choices to anyone. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 months ago. Derek received 12 years in federal prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh because of the pattern of victims, 7 elderly people over 4 years. All systematically robbed of their life savings through similar schemes. Peyton had testified against him, as Richard predicted she would. Her cooperation had reduced her sentence to 2 years, suspended to 18 months with supervised probation. She was required to make restitution for the money that could be recovered, though that amounted to less than $30,000 out of the nearly $700,000 they'd stolen. Have you heard anything from her? Richard asked, settling into his chair with his coffee. I shook my head. The last letter came 2 months ago. I didn't open it. We'd received a dozen letters from Peyton over the past 6 months. Apologies, explanations, pleas for forgiveness. I'd read the first few, but they all said essentially the same thing. She was sorry, she'd made terrible mistakes, she hoped someday we could reconcile. Richard had never read any of them. Do you think we should have responded? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No. His voice was firm, without hesitation. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. She made her choice when she decided to see us as marks instead of parents. The hardest part hadn't been the financial loss, though we'd had to significantly adjust our retirement plans. It wasn't even the public humiliation when the local papers picked up the story. The hardest part was accepting that the daughter we'd raised, the little girl we'd loved unconditionally, had never really existed. Or maybe she had existed once, but had been replaced by someone we didn't recognize. Someone who could look at her aging father and see nothing but an obstacle to be removed. I keep thinking about that night, I said, stirring honey into my coffee. When you called from the train station. How cold your voice sounded. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of cardinals at the bird feeder outside the window. I knew, even then, that it was over. Not just the marriage, not just the house, everything. The family we thought we had. Do you regret it? How hard you were with her at the end? He considered this, really thought about it before answering. I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret being hard with her. She needed to understand the consequences of her choices. Not just the legal consequences, but the human cost. We'd learned through Tom's contacts that Peyton was living in a studio apartment in Sacramento, working as a waitress at a chain restaurant. Her probation officer had helped her find the job, and she was required to turn over 60% of her wages toward restitution payments. It would take her approximately 15 years to pay back what could be recovered. Derek, meanwhile, was in federal prison, where his charm and expensive suits were useless. According to his former cellmate who'd been released, he'd aged dramatically. In just 6 months. The other inmates didn't much care for men who preyed on elderly people. Do you think she learned anything? I asked. Richard finished his coffee before answering. I think she learned that actions have consequences. Whether she learned anything deeper than that. He shrugged. I hope so, for her sake. But it's not our concern anymore. That was the peace we'd found in Cedar Falls. For the first time in years, our concerns were our own. We worried about the weather affecting our garden, about whether we should paint the front porch this year or next, about small, manageable things that affected only us. Mrs. Henderson, our 72-year-old neighbor, had become something of a surrogate family. She brought us vegetables from her garden, invited us to her bridge games, included us in community events. She knew we'd moved from California but didn't pry about why. That kind of respectful distance was one of the things we loved about small-town life. I ran into Sheriff Morrison at the hardware store yesterday, Richard said, refilling his coffee cup. He mentioned they might need volunteers for the youth mentoring program at the community center. Are you interested? Maybe. It might be good to work with kids who actually want guidance. There was only a slight edge to his voice, a small reminder of the wounds that were still healing. The afternoon brought our weekly ritual, a drive up to Lookout Point, where we could see the entire valley spread out below us. We'd started this tradition our first week in Cedar Falls, and it had become a way to mark time, to remind ourselves how far we'd come. 42 years, Richard said, taking my hand as we stood at the overlook. 42 years of marriage. And it took losing everything to find out what we actually had. He was right. The betrayal had stripped away everything we'd thought mattered, the house we'd loved, the financial security we'd worked decades to build, the family we'd believed was unshakable. But what remained was stronger than any of that. Do you think other people would understand? I asked. Why we cut her off completely? Other people who've been through something like this would understand. The ones who haven't. Richard squeezed my hand. Their opinions don't matter. We know what we had to do to survive. Survival. That's what it had come down to. Not revenge, not punishment, but the basic need to protect ourselves from someone who had proven she was willing to destroy us for her own benefit. As we drove home, passing the familiar landmarks of our new life, the diner where we had breakfast every Sunday, the library where I'd started volunteering, the small park where Richard fed the ducks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment, not happiness exactly, because the scars were still there. But a deep, quiet satisfaction with the life we'd built from the ashes of the old one. We were safe here. We were valued for who we were, not what we could provide. We'd found people who treated us with genuine kindness, not because they wanted something from us, but because that's who they were. That evening, as Richard read in his chair and I worked on the quilt I'd started for Mrs. Henderson's great-granddaughter, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and saw a number I didn't recognize. Connie? The voice was tentative, hopeful. It's Peyton. Please don't hang up. I just wanted to. I did hang up. Without a word, without hesitation, without a moment's regret, Richard looked up from his book. Peyton? Yes. He nodded and went back to reading. We didn't discuss it, didn't agonize over whether we'd made the right choice, didn't wonder what she might have wanted to say, because we'd already learned the most important lesson of all. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you protect. And sometimes, protecting your peace means closing the door on people you once loved, no matter how much it costs. The phone didn't ring again that night. Or any night since, and in the quiet of our small house in Cedar Falls, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, we finally found the life we'd always deserved but had been too busy giving away to others to claim for ourselves. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge. It's simply walking away and refusing to let the people who hurt you have any more of your time, your energy, or your peace. We were 71 and 66 years old respectively, and for the first time in decades, we were truly free.